Of course, former CBO Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin on this. Doug, good to have you. What we're talking about back and forth is this battle, I guess, back and forth to how big and sweeping you make the tax cuts. The first hint from the president, that Wall Street Journal interview, as I'm sure you're familiar, that maybe they don't sweep all the way to the upper income, that maybe they don't get a tax cut, that maybe they get a higher rate. Now, we're still unclear as to whether he's talking about the agreed-upon rate that was part of the Trump plan or the rate as it is now. Hard to say, but that other senators, like, Senator Tillis in North Carolina telling us in this show, yeah, I could see leaving them out of this, the rich. What do you think?
I think it'd be a big lift to raise rates on the upper end. I think they've already signaled they're going to go after some of the deductions and loopholes at the upper end, and if they're going to pay more, that's how they'll do it. I think the bigger battle is the one that Charlie was talking about, which is this going to be revenue neutral and thus permanent in reconciliation tax reform, or is this going to be tax cuts that they have to sunset and thus they're temporary? And I think that's the big divide in the Republican Party right now, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
But isn't that kind of a theoretical argument in many ways, Doug? Who cares whether it sunsets in 10 years? Who knows what's going to happen? If you have economic growth in 10 years and, the Republican Party's back in power.
But those are the rules, right? I mean, it's this arcane.
Okay, good. So it sunsets in 10 years. So you got a tax cut for 10 years and,
Yeah, what do you make of that? It sounds to me also that Republicans are now at a point of not only scaling back a health care rework, but scaling back tax cuts. What do you make of that?
I think it reflects the fact that they realize now how hard it is to do these big, sweeping reforms. And they are, I think, really taken aback by the difficulty they've faced on the health care front. How hard it is to stay unified as a party and between the Hill and the White House. And so when they look ahead to tax reform, they know that it's their best chance to get better economic growth, and that's an imperative with the voters. So it's their best chance to solidify their position in 2018. They want to make sure they get something done, and they're worried about trying to bite off too much and failing.
But you know what's the absurdity of this, aside from this whole whether it should be 10 years or permanent? I think you should just go for the 10 years thing.
Take what you can get.
Take what you get. Is that unless you get economic growth up to 3%, it's really hard to pay down the deficit. It gets more difficult with less economic growth. So you have to have some sort of growth.
Something to goose the economy.
Because if you don't have something to goose, if you get 3% economic growth, tax rates do come in at some point, and you can pay down the deficit more. So it's like they got to be able to. I mean, you would think someone's whispering in their ear, take the short-term pain, let the CBO say what it wants to say. Speaking
of the CBO, and you probably heard this, I know you were among 8 CBO directors who have been claiming that the administration and Republicans dumping on CBO figures was not taken lightly. And I talked to Budget Director Mulvaney and others in the administration who said, well, the CBO isn't the Bible, and they went back at you. I want you to react to Mulvaney. He wasn't talking specifically about you, but he was joining you in a group of people he didn't seem to like. React to this. Where does this stand?
Look, the CBO has been wrong. They're challenged with a very, very difficult burden, right? They're supposed to sort of anticipate what a $20 trillion national economy is going to do. They're supposed to challenge with the methodology and how they're supposed to measure a particular piece of legislation. Right. Extraordinarily difficult. Does not undo the fact, however, they're still using Jonathan Gruber's methodology to look at health care bills. The CBO is often touted by folks who oppose a bill as this nonpartisan entity. They are certainly nonpartisan, but the methodologies certainly have their weaknesses. The short answer on
All right, I didn't understand what he said there, but I think what he said, Doug, is that your methodologies and you are the problem. What do you make of that?
I'd say 2 things. Number one, I think it's fair for anyone to question CBO's findings, their methods. That's part of taking the research, turning it into public policy. I think where the line gets drawn is when you assume that CBO is out to tilt the playing field in some way. They're opposed to the bill. You question their integrity, their professionalism. I don't think that's fair, and that's happened on occasion.
I don't think Mulvaney did that.
And I guess not in that interview, but he has in the past.
Okay, but here's where he
Let me finish, Charlie. Charlie, let me finish.
Yep.
The other thing I'd say is he needs to get a mirror and look at OMB's performance. and then we'll talk about who does relatively better.
You didn't. Oh, no, you didn't.
He went there.
Right, wow, he went there.
But you know what? I think what he means by this. I know Mick Mulvaney, and I've been in private meetings with him, and he's clearly not running around attacking the CBO every time he gets a chance. But what I think he's saying is that there is an institutional bias to the CBO's methodology. That it's not a supply. There's not a supply sider among them, or the supply side doesn't factor in.
Democrats will complain about the CBO. Republicans complain about the CBO. Right? You always complain
but they do use static analysis.
You always blame the ref.
Listen, I agree, but if you talk to like supply siders, you're a sports.
That's the way, of
course. But if you talk to like an Art Laffer or Steve Moore or Larry Kudlow or Neil Cavuto, they would tell you that CBO doesn't believe. They believe in static analysis. They don't believe that there is a supply. They don't believe in much of a supply side.
It's hard to dynamically account for that. Right? Yes. That is a problem, right? I mean, it tends, Doug, to be very hard to quantify the boom you get from tax cuts, right? Or have you mastered it by now, or what? Right? Isn't that a problem?
I think. Look, predicting the future is not hard. Being right is very hard, and so I have zero complaint with people who say they've been wrong on occasion. Certainly, my own record there are mistakes. I do think it's fair that to point out that CBO tries to operate on the quote consensus of the research literature. Art Laffer's not a consensus guy. He's got a strong point of view, and it's at one end of the spectrum. I happen to think Art's a great guy and don't disagree with a lot of things, but you're not going to get a government institution there.
All right. Looks like we have a battle brewing, brother. All right. That's my way of handling this.